Kalispera σας, and thank you very much for that very generous introduction. My first visit to Athens was in 1961 when I was traveling south, having participated in the excavations at Nea Nicomedia, directed by Dr. Robert Rodden. And so it was in 1961 that I had the first opportunity to see the Cycladic room in the National Museum in Athens. And I found it a rather overwhelming experience. I was already familiar with... Εκείνο δεν είναι. Με το ποντίκι καλύτερα. Με τα αριστερό εδώ. Αλλάξτε θέμα. It had been my pleasure already to see this wonderful head in the Louvre, which is indeed it's the first object documented as coming from Karros. It went into the collection of the Musée du Louvre around 1860, and so, as I say, it's the first object which we know was indeed discovered in Karros in recent times. And when I saw this, I realized that I'd probably found the topic for my doctoral dissertation, which was the prehistoric cultures, the Neolithic and early Bronze Age cultures of the Cyclades. So it was in 1963 that I first had the opportunity of visiting Karros on a surface survey of known sites in the Cyclades with a permit generously provided by the then EFO, Dr. Zafiropoulos. Now, this is the first object documented as coming from Karros, and this and the one which follows are familiar to you, of course, the wonderful harpist and the flautist, which are now in the National Museum, which were published in 1884 by Köhler. And really that was as far as Cycladic studies developed on Karros until the looting which took place in the years prior to 1963, perhaps the decade prior to 1963, which I first heard about from Dr. Christos Doumas, then Epimelitis, in the Cycladic Islands, and knowing of my intention of visiting the known sites in the Cyclades, he suggested to me that I should certainly visit Karros, which I might not otherwise have done, though I probably would have in view of these previous finds, which are so important. And so in the course of my site surveys, Karros was certainly an important objective for me. And in the previous months I visited Naxos and undertook survey on the east coast of Naxos. I'm one wearing the long trousers there, I think, in that slide. And so there I am in the course of my surface surveys at that time. And so it was on the 24th of July 1963 that I was able to hire a caïque from Arno Koufonisi and make my first visit to the island of Keros and to the location of Karros near Dhaskalio. And there you see the looted area, the horizontal surface from which all the vegetation has been cleared, was the area that was being this area, which was that was essentially the looted area in what we came to call the special deposit, And later on, as I'll explain, we came to call it the Special Deposit North because we excavated further to the south. So on that day, I had the opportunity of collecting surface materials, which was my system, with the permit I had from Dr. Zafiropoulos, and those were later left at the Naxos Museum, where they're still curated. They are photographed on that day, and it was astonishing because I'd already, of course, been visiting a lot of Cycladic sites, and on them it was very obsidian was a very frequent find, as were abundant fragments of pottery, but what one did not expect to find was any marble objects. Indeed, I don't think I found a single marble bowl fragment on the sites that I was visiting otherwise. But on this occasion, I found not only numerous marble vessel fragments, but also fragments of 3 Cycladic sculptures or figurines, which is just a very unusual find on the surface. And so there you see the fragmented folded arm figure, and on this slide also are the other marble vessels, usually, as you see, the marble rolled bowls, which are such a frequent find. But it was the case that all of these things were broken. And so initially, one assumed they might have been broken during the looting process. That seemed quite likely, and indeed that was what most of us in the early days assumed. So there is the island of Dhaskalio, seen on that day from the Karros side, where this photograph is taken from, on the west coast of Keros. And I didn't, on that occasion, visit Dhaskalio, but it was clearly a site to be visited, and indeed it was Professor Dumas who did the first excavations there, as I'll mention in a moment. But here is the view from Megalo Castro on Karros, the view down the coast. So, and here indeed is the location of the area where we later excavated, which became known as the Special Deposit South. So Professor Dumas was the first to excavate on Karros, later in 1963, and he excavated in this now appropriately known as the Dumas House, and he also excavated on Dhaskalio itself. This is the foundations of the Byzantine church, which is the only remains on the islet of Dhaskalio, which are later than the early Bronze Age. And so that was the beginning of systematic work on Karros, both on Karros and on Dhaskalio. And his work was followed in 1967 by the excavations, essentially the rescue excavations of Dr. Fotini Zafiropoulou, and she excavated extensively in the looted areas of the Special Deposit, now the Special Deposit North, and recovered a great deal of material which is now curated in the Naxos Museum. And that is indeed the principal collection of material which is known securely to come from Karros, because, as we'll see in a moment, there is a great deal of material from the looting which appeared on the market subsequently. And among the finds, the most significant that she found, and indeed one of the very few complete sculptures, complete folded arm figures to come from known excavations on Karros, is this impressive figure, which you can now see in the Naxos Museum, which is 58 centimeters high. So there the matter rested really until 1976, when there was the the exhibition, I should say, in the Karlsruhe, the Badisches Landesmuseum in Karlsruhe, Kunstwerke Kladen, where those of us who visited the exhibition, indeed those of us who contributed to the catalogue, because we'd been told there was going to be this great exhibition, and would we contribute introductory chapters on different subjects, we were amazed to find the catalogue was stuffed with objects which were without provenance and unpublished, and which were not otherwise known to science, which clearly, if genuine, as most of them no doubt are, were illegally exported from Greece in recent years. So that was a very shocking thing, and later on there were protests about it. Indeed, a number of us protested at the time, and much later, just a few years ago, the Badisches Landesmuseum has repented and has now got an acquisitions policy along with other museums that have been concerned with ethical issues and do not purchase unprovenanced antiquities. But at that time they certainly did, and they certainly exhibited them. Some of the one or two of the antiquities have, of course, just last year or the year before been returned to the antiquities that they acquired at that time, been returned to the National Museum in Athens. And it was in that exhibition that one first saw this amazing bunch of material from the Erlenmeyer collection. This is a Swiss collector who had purchased these items, and already in the catalogue of the exhibition it was indicated that these were from Keros. Well, how could that possibly be unless they were looted, as indeed they were? And it seems to me likely that these were indeed from Karros. Of course, the trouble with looting is you never know with certainty where things come from, and in the subsequent sale of the Erlenmeyer collection, which took place at Sotheby's in London, I wrote to and contacted the Greek cultural attaché at the embassy in London, and indeed Greece made a formal protest and tried to stop the sale, but there was a short legal action. It went before a High Court judge who ruled that because many of these antiquities had previously been exhibited in Karlsruhe, in the Karlsruhe exhibition, and no protest had been made at that time, he ruled the protest to be out of time, and so sadly the sale went ahead, although some of them were purchased, I should say, in auction, and ended up in the Goulandris Museum of Cycladic Art, which was a much more satisfactory outcome. So this is the important book by Peggy Sotirakopoulos, which tells the story of the so-called Keros hoard, but it's clear, as she points out, there was no hoard, there was just looted material, which was looted in 1963 and the previous decade, which she publishes in her very useful and systematic treatment. So there is a list of the sequence of activities on Karros, the first excavations, as I said, by Dumas, and then those by Fotini Zafiropoulou, when she collected so much useful material, and then I shall go on to say something about the next ones before I hand over to Michael Boyd to talk about the most recent work. And naturally, I would like to express our gratitude to the Greek Archaeological Service, to the present FO, Dr. Athanasoulis, and his predecessors, and naturally to the organizations, the different organizations which over the years have funded these enterprises. Now, here is a happy group. This is from the project which, after the Karlsruhe expedition, in a meeting in London, which the three of us attended, we agreed that it would be good to organize a new project on Keros at the site of Karros in the looted area, and to do a systematic re-excavation in that area. So there you see the three musketeers, or three men in a boat, myself and Professor Marangu and Professor Dumas, both of whom, or all of whom, are present this evening, which is very nice. And so we undertook a survey directed for us by Todd Whitelaw in the shaded area, the complete area on the Karros side, which was a sort of fairly flat area where the activities clearly were. There is the work, the excavation work we undertook in a few small trenches. We were able to sieve material to recover relevant material. And there, from Todd Whitelaw's survey, are the shaded areas of dense finds of pottery. And this was the area, the looted area, the special deposit, which we now call the Special Deposit North, because there was also this area in the south which had quite dense finds, and it was there that clearly further work would be useful, so this indicates the densities of finds in the Special Deposit North, the area, the known area. And here are some of the Potsherds, which were published by my colleague Cyprian Broodbank in Cambridge for his doctoral dissertation. And we also found fragments like this very beautiful fragment of the lid of a pyxis of chlorite schist, with this wonderful spiral interconnecting spiral dissertation. When complete, it must have been a wonderful treasure indeed. And there are a few others known from Cycladic cemeteries which are indeed complete, but none quite so grand and magnificent as this particular piece. So it was then, after the completion of that work, that I thought it would be a good idea to undertake an excavation in this area, the Special Deposit South, which was discovered really in the course of Todd Whitelaw's survey, and also on Dhaskalio itself. And both Professor Dumas and Professor Zafiropoulou, or Dr. Zafiropoulou, and indeed Professor Marangu generously waived their rights to excavate, because of course Dumas and Zafiropoulou had already previously excavated and encouraged the project to proceed. So I'm very grateful to all three of them for that generosity, which meant that we could get on and organize a new excavation. And here is one of the photographs of the first excavation season in 2006 to 2008. I think that's the year 2008, with my colleague Olga Filianiotou, who was the co-director or associate director of that project. So here now you see the excavation trenches in the Special Deposit South, as it soon came to be called, because at once we found numerous finds of marble and both sculptures and broken marble vessels and so on, as well as a lot of pottery and obsidian, but no very great depth of material. And there is the layout of the grid for that work. And here is one very typical group of material found. And the important thing to notice is that it was all broken, systematically broken. We didn't have very much in the way of structures. You see just a small line of stones there. And on the left, you see nestling in there the abdomen of a very large sculpture. We found a piece that joined with it in a square about 10 meters away, and that was originally almost a meter high, and it's the largest sculpture that we found in the special deposit south, although it turns out that in the special deposit north, from the materials which Mrs. Zafiropoulou discovered, there were even larger sculptures found there. And so here is just one variety, the Spethos variety of the marble folded arm figure. Here is the fragments which we found there. And so our inference was, first of all, that these were obviously broken. They were clearly broken elsewhere, because in no case did we find any sculptures which would completely restore. We found one or two joins, we just saw the most important, and so that's an indication that they were broken elsewhere. And as Dr. Boyd will tell you in a moment, we later made the Karros Island survey, and it's certainly clear they weren't broken there. And in a moment, when I tell you about the Dhaskalio excavations, which we undertook in 2008, we found not a single fragment of the marble folded arm figurine form. And we found so many on the Karros side at Karros in the special deposit south, just there had been so many in the special deposit north. So that's a very significant piece of patterning. And it was our conclusion that these materials, marble vessels, marble sculptures, and also pottery, very numerous source boats, they were broken on other islands and brought, or pieces of them, parts of them, brought to the special deposits north and south on Keros, at Karros on Keros. So that's an interesting procedure, and it's clear to us then that these were deliberately broken on other islands, but I think not with any disrespect. I think our favorite theory is that when they went out of use, when they were replaced by new sculptures and new bowls and so on, new ritual objects, the ones that went out of use were deliberately broken, and then parts of them were brought for deposition in the special deposits at Karros, at Karros on Keros, both north and south. And for that reason, it seems appropriate to call the site a sanctuary. So now I move on to Dhaskalio with our excavations in 2008. And you can see the excavation trenches, I hope, clearly enough in that aerial photograph. And on Dhaskalio, we were able to find a really good stratigraphy, as you see here. That's a wall built of marble. I'll tell you about the marble in a moment, but we had a very good stratigraphic sequence at a number of locations on Dhaskalio, whereas in the special deposits, though the material was stratified, it had been stratified probably by digging pits to tip bags or sacks of material brought from the other islands, so that we never had a very satisfactory stratigraphic sequence, although all the material was securely early Bronze Age. But here you see the sort of good sequence we did indeed have, and then we were able to take a lot of radiocarbon samples from bones mainly, but also sometimes from charcoal samples from sieving and from flotation. And there you see a plot of the samples, and to simplify it, there you see the chronology which was possible to reach on the radiocarbon samples, corrected by dendrochronology to give calendar dates. So there you see the earliest date is around 2750 BC, and the latest on Dhaskalio is around 2300 or possibly 2200 BC. But it's clear also from a study of the pottery that the special deposits were laid down in the earlier part of the occupation of Dhaskalio. So Dhaskalio Phase C, at that time, the special deposits had essentially gone out of use. So there is a study by the late John Dixon, our geologist, who studied the marble with care, and he made the rather obvious observation, but it wasn't obvious to us until he made it, that none of the marble is from Keros. Keros does not have good quality marble. So all the marble of which these walls were built, and they're very numerous, all the marble was brought from probably the nearest source of good quality marble in Naxos, which is about 10 or a dozen kilometers to the north of Karros. So that's a lot of marble. I mean, it's tons and tons of marble that was brought by sea from there. And here is one of the typical contexts which we found there. And you see these large discs, which were no doubt flat surfaces used for some purpose. But the most frequent finds were smaller discs, 10 or so centimeters in diameter, and they were overwhelmingly numerous, and we're really rather puzzled still by the number of these discs that we found, which we presume were used to seal ceramic vessels which were imported. All the pottery found at Karros and on Dhaskalio was imported to Karros from other islands, as indeed were the discs. So there were great quantities of imports, and that's a very good documentation of it. So here is the main building at the summit, the so-called hall, as we called it, and these are bits of bedrock protruding, and here is where we found a great number of pebbles, which were brought from other islands, and that is, we concluded, was a ritual activity, which again supports the notion of a sanctuary. But we don't make any suggestions about deities. I'm not at all persuaded that the folded arm figure should be regarded as a deity. Some scholars have said she was a great earth mother, but I think she was, for me, she was just an icon of the Cyclades and of this great centre. So there is the hall looking to the north, and here is a hoard of 2 copper and 1 bronze object, which we found there, which is an important find, and testifies to the importance of metallurgy, which Michael Boyd will talk about in just a moment. We also found a great number of these small pestles, as we call them, which are cylindrical, obviously, of very choice stones, many of them of spondylus, the only use of spondylus shell on the sites we're talking about. And when found at Karros, they were systematically broken, like the other finds, but many of these on Dhaskalio were found entire. And there is a view of the little hall, or not hall, but the little room, platea, which is at the south end of the hall, and there is a Byzantine chapel crossing the site. And here now are the schematic sculptures, which were found, not very many of them, a dozen or so schematic sculptures found on Dhaskalio, and they were frequently found broken also in the special deposits. But I would emphasize once again that not a single fragment of a folded arm figurine or sculpture was found on the settlement on Dhaskalio, but there were hundreds and hundreds, of course, found at Karros. So here are the publications that we've already completed, and I would emphasize the very useful publication by Peggy Soterakopoulos on the pottery. It was her study that had allowed us to be secure in chronological matters. First of all, the stratigraphy, then her study, then the radiocarbon dates. And so that is how we're rather confident about our chronology. And so now I'll hand over to Dr. Michael Boyd, who will speak about the rest of the project, including the Karros Island survey. Thank you very much.
So, good evening from me also. Some of the questions that Professor Renfrew was just raising there about how we can understand this site led us to the conclusion that the next thing we needed to do was to carry out a survey on Keros. There were several questions that arose directly from the work that had already been carried out. What was the place of the sanctuary on the island of Keros? Was it this kind of isolated centre to which people were coming to from elsewhere, or was there in fact some kind of hinterland on the island of Karros itself? We didn't very much expect the answer to that to be yes, because the island of Karros is not a very good prospect for agriculture and settlement. It's a very arid place with not much agricultural land. So our initial expectation was that we wouldn't find much evidence of settlement. We were also interested in the possibility of either production or breakage sites. The breakage in particular, since as Colin has just emphasized, we were absolutely certain that the breakage did not take place at Kavos, so that immediately raises the question, well, where did it take place? And so one possibility would be that it would be somewhere else on the island of Keros, so we wanted to investigate that possibility as well. So the results of the survey turned out to be rather surprising. Here you see just a simple plot of sherd counts. These are just the sherds observed by the walkers as they walked across the island. And you can see, I hope, that it's a much more dense, particularly here in the northwest coastal area. Here's Dhaskalio and Kavos here. And in this northwest coastal area, you have a very dense amount of pottery, but also other parts of the island also fairly dense. So we immediately had to revise our understanding of the intensity of use of the island. And if we have a look at the, well, these are the polygons as we define them. Polygon is our terminology going towards understanding actual sites on the island. And here are some of the chronological results. Late Neolithic, we have a few arrowheads, and those probably relate to hunting visits to the site, so we don't think they indicate anything to do with settlement. Then moving into the final Neolithic, and especially into early Cycladic 1, we have quite a lot of obsidian that we have associated with this period, including several concentrations, these three areas here. But since we have no pottery from this period, we're still a little unsure as to exactly what this represents. It doesn't seem to be real settlement on the island. But then if we look at the ceramics, which I hope we can, there we go. The ceramics of early Cycladic 2 to 3, this is the first period in which we have strong evidence for lots of use of the island, and this is one of the three main periods in which the island was strongly settled. And so you see, I think very clearly that the distribution of these ceramics here and down here matches the overall distribution of the ceramics. So they were, in this period, they were exploiting the entire island. The first conclusion from that, as far as understanding the sanctuary is concerned, is that the sanctuary stands not in splendid isolation on Karros. It stands instead at the head of a quite developed settlement hierarchy. And I'll just show you very quickly, I hope. The Middle Cycladic, Okay. Vaccine. So the middle Cycladic still exploiting this area here, and with a little more around the edges. And then here we have the first millennium evidence, where we have this important building here, Megalo Castro here, and this other important building at Yerani here. So that leads us into the current project, and the first result of the survey really was to inspire us to carry out some excavations on the island of Keros itself in order to follow up directly on the results of this survey. And the field director for this part of the project is Yorgos Gavalas, who's with us tonight. And there were several aims of this work. It was to investigate the nature of the early Bronze Age use of these areas, particularly here in Polygon 2, that large northwest coastal zone, and here in Polygon 4. And then in Polygon 4, we also had the particular aim of investigating some evidence for metalworking that had come up during the survey. Here we see Yorgos Gavalas in action in earlier days. And here we see just one of the small trenches that we excavated. In Polygon 2, perhaps not surprisingly, the results of the excavations were mixed. We have pottery of different periods appearing in these small trenches. But in Polygon 4, very intriguingly, all the excavations so far seem to be entirely of early Bronze Age date. And we also have, from those excavations, discovered some very interesting evidence for metallurgy, metal spills, a fragment of a tuyere, a crucible fragment, and a copper pin as well. So it does seem that the metalworking activity extends beyond the area of Karros itself. So that brings us to the main aspect of the current project, which is the new excavations on Dhaskalio. And there are several aims that we wanted to emphasize in these new excavations. We wanted to look at the earlier phases of the settlement, the 2007 to 2008 excavations, mainly concentrated on the summit, as we have just seen. And those buildings were mainly of phase C in our chronology. So we wanted to understand what was going on in earlier phases on the settlement. We also wanted to extend the excavation out beyond the summit area, so as to find out what's happening on the lower slopes of the hill. And we were also very interested, as we'll see in a moment, in these monumental walls at the north end of the site. Here you see the 2016 team, and here you see some very important persons. Irini Ligaki, who's our Associate Director, and Ioanna Mutafi, who is the Field Director for Dhaskalio. So here's the plan of our trenches that we have opened. In the ones in red are the ones from the current excavation. And we'll start, oops, sorry, wrong direction. We'll start with Trench F, which is at the south end of the summit area. You just see there on the map where that is located. We wanted to open this trench in order to really finish off the excavation of the summit area. And indeed, it has turned out to be the case that much of the material there, as we would have expected, is of phase C. We found this object. It's a petroglyph, one of the few that has been found in a controlled excavation, although it's not really in situ because it's quite high in the fill, so it's probably part of the collapse of that particular building. It was probably in a secondary position. We found these two storage jars in situ built into the floor. These are from, the jars themselves are from Naxos, as far as we can tell from the fabrics of the jars. And then this very important object here, which I shall tell you what it is. I'm going to read this out so I don't get it wrong. It's a one-handled cup of the Castri group, dark slit and highly burnished. It's with elaborate impressed and incised motifs, with no known parallels in the Cyclades or beyond. So now we move to Trench A, and in fact, Trench A from the pottery so far belongs to our Phase B, and indeed all of the rest of the trenches belong to our Phase B, with one important exception that I'll mention toward the end. So that's an important thing that we've discovered, is that in fact much of the site seems to have been constructed during Phase B. Now this is a very large trench. It's 24 meters long, and it's quite hard to see what's going on from this photograph. But if you look on the left here, we've sketched out the walls so we can see how we're getting on so far. Obviously the excavation in this trench is unfinished, and we hope to finish the excavation this year. We can divide this trench into 3 areas. At the top end of the trench here, what we have is a series of walls that seem to have been built around the bedrock. They seem to define the bedrock. They don't necessarily seem to be structural. These seem to be part of the public-facing north end of the site, and we'll have a little more to say about that in a moment. Here in this area, we have a passageway. This is part of perhaps one of the main routes of movement through the site. There's some little stairs here that are only so far partly excavated. And then for the rest of the trench, the southern part of the trench, we have a series of buildings. This one here perhaps being quite public in nature, very nice architecture, a nice threshold there, but also other areas where we have workshop activities going on. Some of the finds from this trench here is mould, probably for a midrib dagger. Here is a seal. This is the only stone seal that we have found. We also have a couple of bone objects, one of which you'll see in a moment. This is a very unusual object, and of course very significant for the interpretation of the site. Now moving over down toward the coast to this area here, Trench H, one of the things we wanted to investigate was how people moved from the Karros side to Dhaskalio. Dhaskalio at that time was joined to Karros because the sea level was about 4 meters lower than it is today. So this corner here was visible on the ground, and we used that as the marker to set our trench. And we had the great luck to discover this staircase here. So this seems to be a major route into the site. And here you see it from the other end. So obviously down here at the rocks, we don't know exactly what's going on, but coming up here would have been this route going into the site. If we look at it on this photogrammetric model, this is from later in the excavation, it's from this year's excavation. You'll see we also have a drain underneath the staircase. So what we have is a very complex construction here. It's something that's been very much planned in advance. It obviously fits, we don't know exactly where it goes after it reaches the edge of our trench, but it obviously fits into a larger plan. There's a real degree of control and ability being shown here. And apart from the drain going underneath the stairs, there's also another drain running through the wall here. One of the themes of Trench H is storage. There's a storage jar on this bench here. We have 3 pithoi in situ here. The pithoi come from, 2 of them come from Amargos and 1 from Eos. And there are 5 other restorable storage jars just from the area of this floor here. Now, moving on to the north end of the island, perhaps you can see here these walls which are visible on the surface. They've always been visible on the surface. We first mapped these in 2008, and we wanted to follow up on these walls to try to understand how the major walls of the site worked. This is what these particular walls look like. They're very well preserved, and they are of course made of that imported marble from Naxos. So we placed these trenches here so that we can investigate these walls at this end of the site. And we'll start with Trench C. This photograph is not the most up-to-date photograph. We've excavated rather more of this area, but you can see the end of the walls coming in here, and then we've begun to excavate this complex here. In this area, this is a later photograph. This is one of the very few areas where we seem to have found some domestic refuse, a large amount of animal bone and other material from this area, but intriguingly, seemingly placed at a level above the collapse, so not really associated with the actual rooms themselves, which hopefully we will get down into this year. At the other end of the trench, complex architecture. These walls built with this lovely Naxos marble, this little window here, and then up here a much stronger feature, perhaps a kind of a tower. Now we move over to Trench B, which is on the other side of those walls. Here, near the top of the site, we have bedrock, which again has this strange procedure of the walls being built around the bedrock. We have this interesting area here with these flat stones, and then here we have the large wall at the bottom of the trench here. So there's more work to be done in this trench. This interesting object was found in Trench B. I've shown this picture to a lot of people and asked them what they think it is. Our first fear was that it might be some kind of inscription, which would mean that there was some kind of later activity on the site. But in fact, no one seems to really think this is an inscription, so that means it's much more likely to be indeed an early Cycladic object, another kind of petroglyph, but one without much parallel so far. So this slide is intended to give you an idea, and to give us all an idea, to get our imaginations moving, about how the island might have actually looked in the early Bronze Age, approaching from the sea, because these are just some of the walls that we've managed to map so far, the more substantial walls. And what they basically do is they create a series of terraces running up the hill, and those terraces all seem to have been used for the construction of buildings. And it does indeed seem to be the case that the entire western and northern and summit area of the hill was constructed at that time. And there you just see the hall crowning the summit of the site there. Now we move over to the eastern side of the hill. There's a major terrace wall running along here, and we're investigating in Trench E an entranceway into the site. This is another entranceway similar to the one I showed you earlier. We haven't got down to the bottom yet, so we haven't found the stairs, but we hope we are going to find some stairs. There's a turn to the right just at the end of the passageway there. We found this beautiful bone seal ring from that trench. The design is almost exactly paralleled by a design from a seal from Left Hand D. This is Trench N, and this is the western half of Trench N, and this is the only part of the site so far in the current excavations where we think we've found structures of phase A, and what this structure here seems to be is a kind of a tower. We're not 100% on that yet. We need to continue the excavation this year, and we hope that by continuing the excavation it will continue to be of phase A, so we'll have a clear phase A element of the site. This small figurine was found, a very, very small figurine, it's about that size, was found in this trench. Now, I want, as Colin mentioned earlier, I want to talk about metalworking a little bit, because metalworking is one of the other major aspects of our site at Karros. And there's two principal areas where we have evidence for metalworking. At the Karros promontory area here, we remarkably have evidence for primary metalworking, that is the smelting of copper from copper ore. So the ore is being imported to the site in order to carry out the smelting there. And then on Dhaskalio itself, we have a large amount of evidence for secondary processes, which I will show you in a second. Very quickly, here's the survey of the promontory area. There's the slag concentration at the north end. And we've done a geochemical survey in 2016-2017. These red dots indicate very high copper readings, which matches what we would expect. Now here's the geochemical survey of the whole of Dhaskalio. And these high readings here for copper are indeed very high. Compared to areas where there's no evidence for metalworking, they are much, much higher. So we have this remarkable result that there seems to be, geochemically, evidence for very high copper readings throughout Dhaskalio, and then lots of high lead readings, although much more localized only at the north end of the island here. So that leads us to Trench L, which I haven't mentioned so far, on the east side of the hill. And the reason why Trench L is so important is it's the first trench that has given us absolutely clear-cut evidence for metalworking processes. There's the geochemical survey for copper in Trench L, next to the plan. And this construction here, it looks like it's a wall, but it's not really a wall. It's actually a constructed workbench, effectively, and it's constructed on top of this area here, which is absolutely full of metalworking remains. Here are some of the things that we found. There's a mold here. There's this little lead axe, tuyere, the famous baking pan fragments, which have copper adhering. I've put a list of the things that we found here. There's more than 200 of these baking pan fragments with copper adhering. So we still don't know exactly technologically what the process is that's going on here, but clearly it involves the use of the baking pans. Just as we were finishing the excavation in 2017, we got down into deeper layers within Trench H. So we're going back to Trench H now to see this potential new metalworking area. There's the geochemical study. These patches of earth here are very hard to make out, but have incredibly high copper readings. There are probably areas on which molten copper was spilled, and then the earth was baked for that reason. And then we also have this artifact here, which is vitrified ceramic. It's a ceramic bowl, probably. It remains to be excavated. We haven't been able to excavate it yet, but hopefully that is an actual metalworking installation in situ. We also found this little hoard of the stone tools, among which was this item here, and it turns out to be a mold for a spearhead, and also a mold for a much smaller object like an awl on this side. So that's for the results of this year's project. I just want to mention very quickly our methodology. We are following a very specific methodology which involves our excavation report approach and digital recording. So I'll just say a few words about that. Our approach to the excavation is to use open area excavation. And the reason why we're doing that, despite the daunting size of some of these trenches, is that the only way to be able to understand how spaces worked together is to open a very large area. So hopefully, we are going to, by the time we finish, we aim to finish at the end of this year, we'll be able to understand how people moved through the site and how the different areas of the site interacted with each other. We're using a complete digital recording process. We don't use paper at all on site. I can't talk about it tonight, we don't have time, but I'm happy to discuss it with anyone who'd like to discuss it with me afterwards. It's called iDig, and it was developed by Bruce Hartzler at the Agora. We use photogrammetry for all our recording, so we don't use paper drawings. Photogrammetry allows us to create these kinds of 3D models, which you've seen one or two of already. We do this at every stage of the excavation. So we've taken many thousands, I think we've taken about 60,000 photographs so far, and we process those to create these numerous 3D models which we can then layer one on top of the other. I want to mention all of the specialists. You've seen the soil chemistry already. I want to mention in particular the micromorphology. Micromorphology has been absolutely central in how we approach this project, because there were several questions at the start of the project that we knew we could only answer if we took the stratigraphy and the micromorphology very, very seriously. So our micromorphologist, Mercini Guma, who is also here tonight, has been with us throughout. She stays for the entire project, the whole 6 weeks, and she spends her time going from trench to trench, examining the stratigraphy and taking these samples, as you can see here. We also have in the field laboratory, we've also digitized the entire process there so that all of the information, for example, from the pottery is gathered and put into the same system so that the next day in the field, the excavators have a record of the pottery that they excavated the previous day. I'd also like to mention the Archaea Botany, which is a very important part of the project. Dr. Evie Margaritis here. We found grape, olive, fig and almond, as well as emmer and barley. Those are the main finds so far. And the big change from the previous excavations is that there seems to be much more of this material in phase B than there was in phase C. Here is a list of all the specialists without whom the project could not function. It's a very large number of specialists. So, just to conclude of where we are at the moment, it brings us back to this object here, which was found in 2008. This is a tin bronze shaft hole axe. And the reason I put this up is because it comes from somewhere else. We don't know where it comes from. Analyses have been done. It doesn't come from the Aegean. It probably comes from Anatolia. And that leads us into the kinds of networks in which Keros was situated. So I've tried to produce a little diagram here, putting Keros obviously at the center of all these circles, which might be cheating slightly, but definitely Keros is involved in all of these networks. So starting with the largest, this is for the pottery, this ellipse here. And Colin mentioned that all the pottery is imported. We don't have any local pottery production. Much of it is imported from fairly close by. I've mentioned the sources of some of the vessels as I was speaking, but we do have pottery from as far away as the Argolid. So there is a vast network of movement of objects, which some of which are ending up at Keros. There's the obsidian, very obviously. That brings a clear loop with Milos. The metalworking gives us this loop here because the ore must have been coming from these western islands here. And then there's all the local materials, and by local I mean the Karros triangle as it was defined by Cyprian Broodbank to involve Amorgos, Naxos and Eos. That's where much of the pottery comes from. It's probably where most of the figurines come from. In fact, most of the figurines, as Professor Maniatis and Dimitris Tambakopoulos have shown, most of them come from Naxos. The stone discs all come from within this zone as well. So what we begin to see is this incredible sequence of networks all layered on top of each other, all involving people and objects moving between these different areas. And we also shouldn't forget the people moving, which is an absolutely central part of how we understand the sanctuary, which is where it all started. So that brings us to just having a kind of a historical sketch about what's happening. Phase A, really, so far we don't see very much evidence for activity on Dhaskalio. The focus is all on Kavos. It's all on these activities in the two special deposits. People coming from far and wide, bringing material with them for this ritual of deposition in the two special deposits. But by phase B, something has changed. There's an incredible concentration happening on Dhaskalio. The marble, which is imported to build the buildings, we're looking at definitely more than 1,000 tons. We have to work out more precisely how much we're talking about. But definitely more than 1,000 tons of marble brought from Naxos. That's an incredible undertaking. That shows that there's an incredible amount of power being centered on Dhaskalio at that time to be able to manipulate and mobilize that kind of material. all of the metalworking evidence, which seems to show that Dhaskalio was a great metalworking centre at that time. That means a lot of expertise as well as materials. And we also have things like the seals and so on. So it seems that at that time it had become a real centre. And then as we move into phase C, the sanctuary comes to an end, and the actual amount of occupation on Dhaskalio seems to recede. The summit area is still very much being used, but much of the rest of the island perhaps not being used at that point. So that's a very brief outline, and I leave you with this image of Keros from Kufonisi, and thank you all very much.